You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by L. Lee Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 27. The Sievertson sisters had, once again, gathered around the kitchen table to engage in their lucrative business of answering their 900 numbers. Unlike other days, Ellie's line, 1-900 Old Ladies, seemed to be ringing off the hook. Ironically, Margie's line seemed to be dead. She picked up the cordless handset to make sure that she still had a dial tone. "Yep, I guess the phone's working," Margie remarked to herself. "Must just be the season for masochistic freaks. The average perverted schmo doesn't seem to be calling today." Ellie hung up her call. "Cheer up, hon. Business'll pick up soon for you. They're probably just taking a break." Ellie's line rang again. She answered the line. Margie rose and walked to the fridge. She retrieved a roll of lefse and smeared a few slices with butter while she eavesdropped on Ellie's call. "Oh, somebody's been a very naughty boy. I'm sure that if I told your mother how you'd been behaving, she would be very disappointed in you. Do you want me to tell your mommy how bad you've been, or should I just take care of matters myself? That's right. Unzip your pants and show me your bare bottom. I'm giving you the spanking of a lifetime for that." She started to relentlessly whack her lefse stick against the wooden table. As a matter of fact, Ellie's lefse stick had become more abused and worn than her pin. "She seems to be doing quite well with those calls," Margie thought to herself as she stuffed her mouth with a delicious potato flatbread. Actually, Ellie might be enjoying this more than her callers. She thought about Ellie's past relationship with Stanley. Then she pondered the fact that Ellie was still the most likely murder suspect for his death. "I'm so glad the sheriff isn't here to see her take this call. There would be little doubt in anyone's mind that she had killed Stanley if they could see how much she seems to like pretending to be Elsa Dietrich." It was now the first week in July, exactly 2 months to the day that she and Stan Jr. discovered Stanley's corpse in the barn. Stan Jr. and his family had returned to Tucson over a month ago, despite Ellie's repeated pleas for him to stay. And it had been 3 weeks since Paul Baker presented Ellie with a warrant to search the house. The following day, Margie granted the medical examiner permission to exhume the remains of her grandmother. Aside from the imminent results of the autopsy, Margie was still unsure about what Jim McDaniel's actual conclusion would be. She considered the thought that perhaps she had hampered justice by tampering with it. Maybe Jim would make things difficult for her out of spite for having been duped by her. Margie wondered more about Jim McDaniel. She hadn't heard from him since she left the medical examiner's office, upset at his refusal to falsify his report. Why did he have to be so stubborn? If I could have only persuaded him to help me out. If I could only have convinced him of what a horrible excuse for a human being Stanley Peters was. As she contemplated her non-existent relationship with Jim, compounded by the sudden scarcity of 900 calls, she determined that perhaps her feminine wiles weren't what they used to be. Even though she never admitted it to anyone, Margie considered the idea that maybe she missed Jim. She wouldn't go so far as to say she loved him, but she rarely admitted that to John, even though they had been married 40 years. If Jim hadn't been so stubborn and hurt, they could have had something more. Well, she thought, maybe Paul can use his wiles to convince him to get both me and Ellie off the hook. Ellie concluded her call with one forceful snap of the lefse stick to the table. She practically screamed into the phone. "Now, I hope you're satisfied with yourself. You need to think about what you've done. Don't call me unless you're ready to apologize." She hung up the line, smiling almost evilly. This disturbed Marge a bit. Her jaw dropped, revealing the chewed-up bits of flatbread still in her mouth. Ellie looked up at her sister. "What, hun? Something wrong?" Margie shook her head in disbelief. "No, Ellie dear, nothing at all." Just then, Margie's 900 line started to ring. She enthusiastically picked up the call even before the second ring had finished. 1-900 Hot Mama, this is Gabrielle. Tell me about your intimate fantasies. Margie grinned from ear to ear as she listened to the caller identify himself. Ellie watched her sister intently while Margie became suddenly perky. "Who is it, hun? Is it him?" She now listened quietly to Marge's end of the phone conversation. She acknowledged that the caller on the line was, indeed, her estranged lover, Dr. Jim McDaniel. Ellen had no clue what Margie's lover was actually saying to her, but she seemed to enjoy living vicariously through her older sister as Marge fielded her call. Ellie cheered her sister on and joyfully whispered, "Oh, I'm so glad for you, hun." Jim McDaniel called Marge to inform her that he was about to issue his final report on the death of her grandmother. He concluded that Sigrid had been poisoned by thallium. This was supported by the trace metal hair analysis on the lock of hair Marge provided, as well as the hair samples taken from her grandmother's exhumed body. He had concluded that the box of yum-yum rat victuals recovered from the Sievertson kitchen was consistent with the exorbitantly high levels of thallium found in the hair shaft of Sigrid Sievertson. She was most likely poisoned by Stanley. He theorized that Stanley methodically tampered with the lutefisk Mrs. Olstad so thoughtfully prepared for his wife's dying grandmother before serving it to her in bed. Jim also stated that, in his expert opinion, Stanley must not have been too bright a criminal. Although he seemed to evade suspicion from members of the Himmel community by killing Sigrid with kindness, he never once felt compelled to hide the murder weapon, the old box of rat poison, or his recipe for murder, his marked-up copy of the Pale Horse. Jim also added, prior to the EPA ban on thallium-laced rat poison in 1972, people were dropping like flies. In fact, thallium and its predecessor metal arsenic were sometimes facetiously known as inheritance powder. He commented that unless the killer's family and friends started mysteriously dropping dead one after another, officials were not necessarily clued in to anything suspicious. Often, the victim was dead before being reduced to seeking medical attention, and the murderer was usually in charge of the final disposition of the corpse. They would make every attempt to expedite burial as quickly as possible before arousing suspicion about the true nature of the deceased's death. Marge listened intently as Jim talked about Stanley's case. Then he spoke about Stanley's murder. He had also determined that since Stanley had unquestionably murdered Sigrid, and since Stanley himself was now dead, the best thing for all parties involved would be to conclude that Stanley died in the barn of accidental means. He hadn't derived the exact details of Stanley's official death, but Jim stated adamantly that he would not mention the beatings with the lexapin or the final death blow to the chest with the screwdriver. Ultimately, if there was no mention of foul play in the final report, there would be no murder investigation. Upon hearing this, Marge heaved a great sigh of relief. Her little sister was no longer the prime suspect in Stanley's death, because officially, Stanley wasn't killed, and Margie would no longer be faced with the dilemma of a false confession. "I don't know how to thank you enough, Jim. If it's worth anything, I'm sorry that I underestimated you. I'm truly grateful for everything." There was a short pause as Jim changed the subject. He explained that he called Margie on the 900 line because he still didn't know how to get in touch with her. He could have gotten her information from Paul, but he felt it less intrusive if he asked her personally. He wanted to see her again, and he wanted to come by and visit. Marge immediately switched into flirtation mode. "Oh, and you're tired of paying $5.99 for the first 5 minutes and 99 cents thereafter?" So you want me to give you my home number and my address? How do I know I can trust you? She teased Jim, but she finally consented to giving him her private home number and the farm address. He stated that he would be leaving his apartment shortly to come up and see her. In the meantime, she needed to get rid of her kid sister so they could engage in some, as he put it, long overdue naked wrestling. Okay, Jim, I'll see you in an hour. Drive fast. As she hung up the line, Ellen clapped for her sister once again. Oh, Marge, he's coming to see you now? She inquired. He'll be here in about an hour, Margie answered. Say, Ellie interrupted, giddy with excitement for her sister. Say no more, hun. I'm going to town. As she walked to the door, she turned to Margie and hugged her. Really, hun, I'm so happy for you. Although she was unaware of the details which eventually reunited Margie and Jim, Ellen was happy for her sister. She thought to herself, Margie has finally found someone who will make her happy. She had been so lonely after John died. She borrowed the Lincoln to make her trip to town. Margie doesn't need me in her hair, she thought. She needs time alone with her new beau. She turned from the entrance to the driveway onto the main road and noticed an abandoned pickup on the side of the highway. She also noted that the pickup had North Carolina plates with the slogan, First in Flight. It looked as though the owner left his truck there and walked back to town. Ellen kept her eye out in the distance for any wandering hitchhikers. She considered the North Carolina plates on the car. She had never seen North Carolina plates and pondered the First in Flight slogan. For a moment, she reminisced about her students at Himmel Elementary. Ellen had often read them stories about the first flight of Wilbur and Orville Wright. It's nice that an entire state would be able to take ownership of the accomplishments of two such creative boys, she thought. She continued her diversion to town as her thoughts turned again to Margie and her lover. I would certainly love to meet this doctor if Margie ever introduces me. An hour later, Margie waited anxiously for Jim McDaniel to meet her at the farm. She dressed casually in her blue jeans and t-shirt, but she powdered her face and put on a fresh coat of makeup. After all, I don't want to appear too desperate. Pretty but casual is the best look for now, she thought. She also tried not to gaze out the window too impatiently. She had determined that she would go about her daily routine and wait for Jim to knock on the door when he arrived. 15 more minutes passed before Margie heard footsteps on the front porch. She waited a few more minutes, expecting to hear a knock on the kitchen door. A little while longer, there was still no knock. I was sure that I heard someone out on the front porch, she thought. Marge began to feel a bit paranoid. As a precaution, she grabbed up the first potential weapon she could find, Ellie's lefse pin. She finally ventured out the kitchen door to the porch. Jim, she called. Are you playing with me? Jim. Come on, Jim. I know you're out here. You know I'm much too old to be playing these games. I'm an elderly woman. What if I fall and break a hip? She decided to step off the porch and search around back. He has to be hiding from me. I heard him just minutes before. The moment she stepped off the porch, someone had grabbed her from behind. He had his arm wound tightly around her neck, pulling him close to her. In fact, his grip was so tight, she realized he was seriously trying to choke her. Let go, you moron, she gasped. Jim, this is not funny. She uttered these words as her assailant tightened his grip around her neck even more forcefully. He coldly whispered into Margie's ear as he pulled her closer to his breast. Nice to see you all again, Miss Gabrielle. Remember me? Marge's eyes widened in fear. This wasn't Jim McDaniel who held her in this chokehold, but she did recognize the man's voice. Jack? She asked, terrified. He roughly yanked her hair as he spoke to her from behind. "Oh, you're good, Miss Margie. That is your name, right, Margie?" While Jack spoke to Marge, he yanked periodically in her ponytail to emphasize his point. "It seems y'all pulled the wool over my eyes. I thought you was a young lady. Come to find out, you was older than my mama. Nice y'all's sister to tell me about where y'all lived." "Ellie," Margie stated weakly, all the while gasping for breath. She dropped Ellie's lexapin on the ground beside her. "That her name? I thought it was Miss Daytrick or something. Nice to know. I guess she's gonna be next." He yanked on her hair once more. Marge had always suspected during her phone conversations with Jack that he had the makings of a serial killer. Her only consolation was that Jack had no idea where she lived. And now she knew that her little sister had unknowingly sold her out to this guy, who most certainly intended to kill both her and Ellie. But Margie hadn't lived for 35 years in Florida without being a little crafty to the ways of the average serial killer. Jack had called her because he found her sympathetic. She determined to talk her way out of this predicament. Get them to sympathize with you. Make them understand there's a human being behind the face, and it'll be harder for them to kill you. Okay, Marge acquiesced. "I admit, I lied to you. If you just let me go, I can explain, Jack." "Oh, no. I will not let y'all take advantage of me like that. I can see right through y'all." "No, Jack," Margie assured. "You don't know anything. You don't know how I feel about you. I made Ellie tell you where we lived. I wanted you to come see me." Her face was beet red as she struggled to speak and inhale small gasps of air. "Just let me go, Jack. I'll show you what I mean." He had held his grip for so tightly for so long, her consciousness was beginning to fade to black. "You promise? No funny stuff." Marge nodded. She was no longer able to speak. "I mean it. If y'all try something, I'll fucking kill you." Marge nodded again. He slowly released his grip and stepped back. Marge heaved in a desperate gulp of air, taking in several deep, wheezing breaths. She leaned against the porch rail while she slowly regained her senses. She struggled to reoxygenate her brain while she surveyed her current situation. She could not lose her sense of reason. She had to remain calm. Ellen had taken the Lincoln. It seemed hopeless. There was no means for Margie to escape. The only tool she had at her disposal was Ellie's lexapin, which lay on the ground beneath her feet. However, it was apparent that her assailant also had no vehicle nearby. Therefore, he had no immediate means of escape. She figured that he must have parked his car somewhere remotely. She clearly had two choices. She could sweet-talk Jack into letting her go, or she could render him physically unable to make chase. She would try the former, relying on the latter option as a plan B. Marge stood for several minutes while she tried to stall Jack and assess her options. Then she turned to him. "You know, Jack, I have a lot of callers call me. All kinds of guys. But there's nobody like you." She moved toward him and caressed his cheek. "You're special." She tried to seem believably infatuated with him, but in reality, it was more than Margie could do to keep from puking in his homely face. "I mean, you're so handsome. I can't believe you don't have a girlfriend. Why is that? Your mama probably doesn't think the kind of girls you bring home are good enough for you." John Jacob pushed Marge's hand away disgustedly. "My mama don't like nothing nowadays. It's rightly 'cause she's dead." "Oh, you poor baby," Margie stated sympathetically. "She passed away?" "I killed her, just like I'm gonna kill you." As Jack approached Marge once more, she bent down to quickly scoop up Ellie's lexapin. She grabbed it by its red wooden handle and wound it behind her head, striking John Jacob forcefully on his forehead. He reeled in pain, holding his noggin in his hand. Then she whacked him again 7 or 8 times. All the while, he shielded himself defensively from her relentless blows. As she furiously wailed on his skull and forearms, he screamed in wild pain. She thought to herself, this must be what Ellie felt like when she whacked off old Stanley. Finally, she swung the pin behind her underhandedly so she could lay one hard and desperate shot to the groin. Unfortunately, John Jacob had anticipated this move and managed to grab the pin away from Marge. She was now without a weapon. The lexapin was her only approximate means of self-defense. She fled out toward the barn as fast as her legs would carry her. Perhaps if she equipped herself with one of the old rusty tools left there, she could disable Jack. Regrettably for Margie, her flight to the barn wasn't really much of a chase at all. Despite a bruised noggin, the wiry and spry John Jacob caught up with her within 50 feet. He dropped the lexapin and grabbed her around the neck once more. Then he tightly wound her ponytail around his hand and dragged her another 100 feet out to the barn. Once again, Marge tried to plead for her life. Please, Jack, don't do this. I know you didn't mean to kill your mother, and you don't want to kill me. Furious, John Jacob struck Margie with a closed fist to the side of her skull. Shut up, bitch! Don't say another word. I'm gonna fucking kill you. He said nothing more, but brutally dragged her off to the open doors of the empty barn. He threw her prostrate on the ground. She pleaded again with her face in the dirt. Please, Jack, I don't want to die. He grabbed the 50-foot spool of heavy-duty rope and threw the entire weight of his body into Marge's back. John Jacob was only 145 pounds, but he pounced on her so savagely that the force completely knocked the breath from her. He ruthlessly tied her hands behind her. Then he hoisted her weak but still conscious body up by a beam of the loft and secured the opposite end of the rope by a hook on the barn door. She whimpered and pleaded for her life, but she was now bereft of energy. I'm going to die here all by myself, she murmured to herself. While she sat there, weak and hopeless, Marge heard the sound of a car pulling up. Oh my God, she thought, Ellie is here. But then, when she considered the hopelessness of her situation and the potential danger to her sister, she screamed as loudly as her lungs could manage. Ellie, go get the sheriff! Don't come in here! He's gonna kill us! What, you bitch? Again, John Jacob struck Marge with a closed fist. You keep your fucking mouth shut! He marched over to the far edge of the barn and grabbed a large, rusty shovel. He hid behind the open barn door, waiting for Marge's rescuer to approach. Marge hung there, still suspended by her wrists and battling the blinding sunlight through the open barn doors. A figure appeared in the distance. It approached through the open barn doors. She struggled to make out the silhouette approaching from beyond the blinding sunlight. Tears and dirt also hampered her vision. Squinting, she realized it was Jim. He had finally arrived and heard her cries from the barn. Jim, behind you! Before Jim could see who was behind him, John Jacob had struck him once on the back of the head with a rusty shovel and knocked him unconscious. 20 minutes later, Jim McDaniel regained consciousness. He found himself also suspended by his wrists from a beam in the loft of Marge's barn. Marge still hung a few feet down from him. She was desperate and hysterical and called to Jim to get him to wake up. She tried to persuade Jack not to hurt him. Take me, Jack. You don't need him. He doesn't mean anything to me now. Let him go. But her efforts were to no avail. John Jacob stood, coldly ignoring her, as he honed a rusty side blade with a whetstone. He methodically and rhythmically sharpened the blade, lost in his own bloodthirsty rumination. Marge glanced over at her lover as Jim slowly regained his wits. Her wrists were now raw, and she continually struggled to free herself of her bonds. Her face was bruised and bloody, yet Jack stood, undeterred by her suffering and struggles, even as Jim regained consciousness. John Jacob looked up at Jim, now aware that his second victim had come to his senses. "Look like Miss Margie's got a boyfriend," he stated calmly. He lifted the scythe blade to Jim's chin, smiling to reveal the 50-cent gap between his two front teeth. "Y'all look awful purty. Come for a date?" He studied his adversary in love. Then he studied the certain look of terror in Margie's eyes as he smiled. "Oh, I get it. She likes you." John Jacob nodded decisively and winked at Jim. "And she's gonna love it when I kill you first." He held the side blade close to Jim's throat, grazing his flesh. He pursed his lips as he studied the small drop of blood dripping down his victim's neck. Then he wiped Jim's blood off the tip of the blade with his index finger and licked his bloody fingertip. He examined the shimmer of the blade more intently. "Nah, this is too rusty." He picked up a ball-peen hammer and a 12-inch block of wood, holding the blade in his hands. John Jacob looked around the barn, shaking his head. Marge knew from having watched Anders peen the scythe that he was looking for something to sit on. The 5-gallon paint can wouldn't work for peening. Father had determined that the best peening stool for our rusty scythe blade was the old stump out back. Margie spoke up, hoping that he would pay enough attention to hear. "There's a stump out back. You can sharpen that thing out there." John Jacob smiled at Margie. "Oh, I get it. Maybe you're tired of this one after all. Or maybe you just don't want to prolong his suffering." He shook his head as he sadistically snickered to himself. "I'll be back. Don't you try nothing, you hear?" He marched out the barn doors with tools in hand as he headed for the old tree stump. Jim had now fully regained his senses as he glared at Marge in disbelief. "You trying to help him kill me better?" he asked sarcastically. "Shut up," Margie whispered urgently. "We got to get each other loose before he gets back. Don't make any noise." John Jacob had suspended both Marge and Jim by a beam of the loft. They were both tied by their wrists at either end of one long length of rope. Marge propelled her body closer to Jim's by pushing her feet against a nearby beam. "This is all one rope. If you get me free, we both fall down." "What am I supposed to use?" Jim asked skeptically. "Try pushing yourself toward me. I will wrap my legs around your waist, and we can try to untie each other," she commanded. As Marge once again pushed herself off, Jim swung his legs back and forth. "Wait," he stated. "We need to count so we can get together at the same time. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Finally, they met at the center of the beam from which they were suspended. Margie wrapped her legs around Jim's waist to hold him in place. Still, their wrists were 5 feet apart, suspended above them on the beam. Their hands would not reach. "That's definitely not going to work for us," Jim quipped. "Although I do like the sensation of having your legs wrapped around my waist again. This is a pretty good way to go. I mean, if you're going to get cut open wide by a serial killer." "Shut up, idiot. I'm not about to give up yet," Margie snapped. She countered more humbly. "I'll bet you're sorry you showed up here." "Hey, if you're going to die, you might as well die with a woman you love." Despite the desperateness of their current situation, Jim said this all matter-of-factly. "Wait a minute. Did you say that you loved me?" Margie asked. "Sure," said Jim. "You could say I was about to fall to pieces about the whole breakup. Well, maybe cut to pieces is a better choice of words." He chuckled inappropriately. For 15 more minutes, Marge and Jim exhaustively tried to maneuver themselves free of their bondage. In fact, they had become completely oblivious to the whereabouts of Jack. While they made one last heated attempt to free their wrists of the rope, they plummeted 5 feet to the ground below. They looked up to see that John Jacob stood above them with a fully peened and sharpened scythe. He had used his sharpened blade to cut the rope free. He now stood with a demented and murderous expression. "I'll just give y'all a little hand there," he stated menacingly. Marge had fallen face first onto the ground below as the wind had once again been knocked from her lungs. But Jim had fallen on his backside and was still reeling from the painful impact to his lower spine. His wrists were still bound in front of him. John Jacob lifted the scythe above his head as Marge screamed. Knowing that he would soon be sliced to bits, Jim lifted his bound hands to reflexively shield himself from the blow. Jack flung the scythe blade at his stomach, leaving a 1/2-inch deep gash across the width of his abdomen. He had sliced through Jim's white cotton shirt, which was quickly becoming soaked with blood. "Heh, thought I was going to kill you right there, nut. No, that was just practice." Jack laughed demonically, reveling in his perversion. Once more, John Jacob raised the scythe above his head. Jim cringed. Marge lifted her face up and screamed as she watched John Jacob's expression. His once cold, lifeless eyes had transformed into those of a bloodthirsty predator. Still helplessly bound, she could only watch as he raised the blade in the air and laughed. The moment John Jacob started to bring his weapon down on Jim for one final blow, they heard a gunshot blast. John Jacob bolted backward, dropping the scythe behind him as he fell to the ground. His eyes were still wide open, frozen with a look of pure evil. And between his eyes lay the entrance wound from a single gunshot. Marge and Jim turned and squinted through the sunlight and the open barn doors. An image stood at the entrance, brandishing a firearm. It was Ellie. She had shot John Jacob between the eyes using Stanley's prized World War II rifle. "Oh my God, it's you, Ellie!" Marge cried out in absolute relief. Ellie marched into the barn, still charging with the rifle. She walked over to the lifeless body of John Jacob Harvey and kicked it hard in the ribs. She bent down to examine his face. "That was Jack!" Marge cried hysterically. "He was so gonna kill us, Ellie! You saved our lives!" Realizing that John Jacob Harvey was now dead, Ellie lowered her firearm. She studied his face and his frozen, evil expression. She sympathetically patted him on the cheek as she spoke to his lifeless corpse in an almost angelic voice. "Looks like Jack has been a very naughty boy. Eh?